Let's talk a little bit about Stephen King's new novel, Never Flinch, which is the third instalment in the Holly Gibney standalone stories, and I believe the 7th book that features Holly Gibney as a main character. I have some thoughts on this book, but rather than just giving you a standard review, I wanted to go into a little bit more detail regarding both the story and kind of the overall consensus around Stephen King's newer books and kind of the current sort of stage they're in terms of, quality, and just really have an open discussion regarding not just this book, but his recent books in general. Please be aware that any opinions in this video are my own. As a result, may differ from yours, which is absolutely fine. That is perfectly normal, and we could have a nice, happy, open, healthy discussion in the comments if you so wish to. To kick things off, I'm going to be completely frank. I had quite a difficult time finishing this story. Now, I'm unsure if this is because of any kind of preconceived ideas of grandeur based around Stephen King's books. I'm a big fan. I pre-order every new book that comes out, so maybe it was my kind of preemptive ideas about how it was going to go, because let's be honest, when Stephen King releases a new book, I'm going to pre-order it, doesn't matter what it's about. However, I do think it's completely healthy and normal to have criticisms of your favourite writers' books. I have read some incredible books by Stephen King. I've also read some complete duds, and unfortunately, Never Flinch does kind of fall into the latter of that category. Now, Never Flinch picks up pretty quickly after the events of Holly. I believe some time has gone, but no kind of particular time frame off the top of my head. I imagine maybe a year or two. And to be clear, I absolutely loved the story of Holly, so I was really intrigued to see what this book was going to bring. Without spoiling things, the main story follows two kind of main overarching stories that intertwine. The first being regarding a mass murderer who is currently, causing all these murders, and Holly is, brought in as an assistant for the police to assist with solving those murders. The other story follows a religious zealot who is on the hunt for a public figure, a feminist public figure, who is doing, various rallies around America, and, is trying to cause harm to this public figure. And Holly is brought in as a bodyguard of sorts. Now, this may sound like quite a lot of information to take in, and the answer is, it is. That's my main kind of concern with this book. I felt as though it felt as if Stephen King wanted to write two separate stories, and for some reason ended up merging them into one story, when actually both stories respectively are very interesting in concept, but in execution didn't quite hit the nail on the head. And as a result, some parts of the story kind of fall off. Some stuff takes more of a precedence than others, and then subsequently, as the story comes to an end, one story kind of takes a bit of a backbench to the other story. As a result, it felt a little bit empty. I want to be completely clear, the subject matter had nothing to do with my kind of thoughts around the overall story. I really enjoyed the concept of both, but I did feel as though it lacked in execution because of the kind of having to merge these two together. Now, that being said, there were aspects to this story I really enjoyed. Holly Gibney as a character always delivers. I love the kind of character progression we've seen from her since like the Mr. Mercedes trilogy. If you think back to when she was in that and the way she was and how different she is of a character now, the growth is unreal, and it's honestly worth reading just for Holly Gibney alone. I did also like some things that were kind of revealed near the end. King's really good at kind of creating scenarios and storylines that leave it up to the reader to kind of decipher whether it's a supernatural thing or a person thing. Without spoiling things, there was just this one particular part of the story that kind of showed its face near the end in respect of kind of what was going on, and again, really enjoyed it in classic Stephen King fashion. Very creepy, very weird. Always a good time. However, with that being said, even though I've enjoyed Holly Gibney's story, and I enjoy Holly Gibney as a character, and I don't doubt we'll be seeing more of Holly Gibney in future books. However, I do feel as though Stephen King has maybe slipped into something that feels maybe comfortable. Now, I'm completely not qualified to make that comment, to be perfectly honest, but it does feel as though he's found a character he enjoys writing, and it's a good character, and has sort of, as a result, ended up creating stories that are centered around this one character, but not really kind of pushing the bar really. I would personally like to see next a different kind of story, or maybe a story with Holly in, but as a side character, much as she was in The Outsider, which was actually my introduction to Holly Gibney. I read that before. I'd read the Mr. Mercedes trilogy. I really liked her in that story, and I think she works really well as a side character brought in. But I'm a little bit done with Holly Gibney for now, at least the standalone stories. I would like to see something fresh and new in the next kind of novel release. Now, there may be more than meets the eye in this situation here, because what really kind of caught my eye at the end of the book was the afterwords, or the afterthoughts from King himself, where he does mention that he had a hip operation in 2023. As a result, it pretty much looked as though he wasn't going to finish the book. He also mentioned the following.
Never Flinch has gone through multiple rewrites and 3 title changes. I'm finally happy with it. Or, let us be truthful, happy enough. It's never all I'd hoped for, but there comes a point where you must let it go.
Now, hearing this made me kind of feel as though that Stephen King was maybe kind of not particularly happy with this story himself. I mean, I might be reading too deep into it, but it did feel as though that kind of what he said there kind of indicates that, you know, there was either more he wanted to write, or, you know, kind of fill some gaps a little bit. But for me, it just didn't quite hit the nail on the head with this one, I'm afraid. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the kind of the controversies around kind of modern King books versus classic King, because there is a lot of debate regarding kind of the general kind of quality and sort of, you know, popularity of newer King books. My personal thought is that I think a lot of newer Stephen King books get a bit of a bad rap. People do like to really bring into the conversation about older King works, and of course, there's some amazing books he's wrote. That being said, there's books like The Institute, for example, which is essentially kind of a rehash, if not a bit of a sequel to Firestarter. I personally feel as though is a much better book than Firestarter. I've actually struggled to finish Firestarter many times, you know, in respect of the story. For some reason, just doesn't click with me. However, The Institute I felt was a much more fleshed out and just a better book in general. Another example is I really enjoyed Fairy Tale, which came out a few years ago, which kind of entered more into that world of kind of the strange and unusual, similar to kind of The Talisman and The Dark Tower, which is not something that he's really kind of stepped foot in since finishing the Dark Tower series. So Fairy Tale was a really great way to kind of dip your toes back into that sort of side of Stephen King, and I really enjoyed Fairy Tale, and I think it's a really fantastic book. And of course, the hard case crime novels are also really fun as well. Really enjoyed Later. That was a really good, solid read. In my opinion, I don't believe that Stephen King is writing bad books. However, I will say the bar is set very high, because unfortunately, Stephen King has wrote some of the greatest books in the world, some of the you know, pinnacles of what we will look back at as the greatest horror fiction and science fiction and fantasy books ever, you know, ever written, at least of the 20th century. When the bar is that high, subsequently there are going to be criticisms about newer books, because how can you create it, you know, The Shining, Pet Sematary again? It's impossible. So there's always going to be that element of it as well. Another factor I feel as though an unfair criticism is around kind of modern politics in a lot of Stephen King's books. Now, for example, in Holly, there was a lot of discussion around COVID, and even in this one, there's discussions around COVID and stuff, and there's a lot of debate because obviously, you know, Stephen King is quite left-leaning in that respect, you know, very, very conscious of that side of things. So that's going to sort of spread out into his books as well. However, that being said, you know, the characters, particularly Holly Gibney, is quite left-leaning and someone who would be very, like, conscious of stuff like COVID and everything of that nature. So, as you can imagine, the books do reflect that. Now, I will say that Stephen King books have always been somewhat political, and I think sometimes it unfairly gets a bit of a bad rap, newer books at least, because a lot of readers are reading Stephen King books, you know, that were set in the 80s and 70s and are reading them now. So a lot of the politics kind of goes over our heads a little bit because it's something of the past that we don't really think of. But, you know, there's loads of examples where he talks about Nixon, he talks about, you know, JFK, you know, there's a lot of kind of American politics thrown in there. It's just that the books are now not set in that time period because he's not writing them in that time period. They're set in modern day. So there's going to be discussions around, Republicans, Democrats, COVID, all that sort of stuff that's very prominent today. So not a lot is changed in that front. I think we just need to remember that we are not in 1970s anymore, or we're not reading a book that's set in the 70s, so there's going to be different discussions. But I get it, it does get sometimes a bit much, especially when you're just trying to switch off and read, but equally, I don't think it's the be-all, end-all of his books. Moving forward, personally for me, I would like to see Holly Gibney, unfortunately for some, placed on a shelf for the time being. I think we've seen a lot of Holly Gibney, and I've enjoyed them. However, I am ready to have something new. Or, alternatively, as I say, have Holly in the story, but as a, shoot-in kind of side character, similar to The Outsider. I think that would work great. But I want to see something new. I want to either see a brand new storyline entirely, or actually what I would really like to see is maybe revisiting some of the classics, maybe some sequels to stuff that we haven't seen. We have, obviously, for example, Doctor Sleep, which I absolutely enjoyed when I read it, and thoroughly enjoy it now still. In terms of that side of things, I really, really want to see more of kind of revisiting old characters. Maybe some characters, how are they getting on in 2025? Are they, still around? Just something of that nature where we can pop them in there, maybe as a side character, or shoe them in somehow into a story. I just think that'd be really cool. Now, if I'm being completely honest, I would rather just see more Dark Tower, to be honest. Like, if that was really down to me, I would just want to see some more Dark Tower. I'm not done with Dark Tower. Mr. King, you could even put Holly Gibney into a Dark Tower story. I would read it. I don't care. Just get us some Roland, get us back to Midworld. Put Holly Gibney in there if you want, but I want to see some more Dark Tower. So that's just my thoughts. I will never not enjoy the Dark Tower. In conclusion, Never Flinch was a story I had very high hopes for. However, for me personally, did not quite deliver. The story at times did feel very overcrowded and felt as though it should be two separate novels. Does this mean I won't be buying Stephen King on pre-release? Absolutely not. I will continue to pre-order his books as soon as they become available. I'm still a massive fan. Just for this one, for me, just didn't quite hit the mark. And as much as I've enjoyed Holly Gibney's story, I'm ready to have something new. And I think it's time that Stephen King puts down Holly Gibney for a bit and then comes back to her maybe later on. I don't doubt this is the last time we're going to see Holly Gibney. I'm sure we'll see her plenty more. But for now, I'd like to see something new, something a bit fresher. And in my humble opinion, that's what I'd like to see. However, I'm not the writer. Mr. King will make his decision on that front, I imagine. Thank you for watching. More reviews to come. Sorry they've been not so much recently, but we'll get there. Thanks for watching. Take care. Goodbye.